When I was building the syllabus for the class, I wanted to really push a section on the ethical relationships and standards and expectations. And so they had to read and consume a lot of material about sort of what, specifically from a feminist standpoint. So what are the ethics of when you're collecting someone's story, what does that mean? And we practiced doing interviews and asking about sort of sensitive topics with each other. And then they had to like write up a response or an analysis of what their peer said in order to feel what it felt like to be responsible to share someone else's story. And we spent a ton of times talking about sort of authority and what role the researcher plays in a project where their voice is going to be heard, but it shouldn't be the center. And then I made sure that they practiced some really sort of focused on ethical relationship practices. So one of the things we did was we shared our questions before we did our interview. We had follow-up questions, so like they didn't exactly always stick to the script, but they got to see our main points. And then after the data was collected and the interviews were done and transcribed, we sent the transcription back to each member so that they could go through and edit out parts they didn't want to share publicly. And they, of course, there's some IRB questions about consent. And as an oral history project, technically you don't need consent, but because we were so concerned about making sure we were respecting everybody's autonomy and making sure we were practicing what we preach, we got informed consent from every participant. And we did it multiple times in multiple ways. Like we got it for their individual interviews, for the group interview, and for photographs and whatnot. And so once the membership got back their transcripts and they went through and edited them, then I had Joel at that point was the one who was primarily working on this. He went through and he edited the audio and the transcript. So there were two versions of each interview. There was a clean version, which is the kind that, or the version that goes up on the archive, or that it will be shared at the museum. And then there's a deeper version, which we can use for other forms of analyses. But since that wasn't the main goal, and they know that, like the membership, I told them many times, like we want to have a clean version that you are comfortable sharing publicly, and then the version with the stuff that's more private that will be used in a very different way, anonymized and so on and so forth. And they were okay with that. But it was a process because there was a lot of like, I don't want to sound dumb. And we had certain members who felt like they came off as too negative or something. They just wanted to throw the whole thing away and not do it, right? And so there was some conversation with the members about, we recognize that you feel self-conscious about this, but here's why we think it's important that your story is shared. And that was an ongoing conversation. It's still ongoing with some of our members because they want to appear a certain way, and we're sort of not so much interested in how they appear, but what they're telling us. And so it was a tension. But being able to work with the students through that tension and negotiate that was really, I think, useful for them because they could see sort of how difficult that negotiation might be. And they could like learn how to actually engage in that kind of negotiation. So it was a lot. I worried a lot about how we might practice this in a way that felt ethical. And I was lucky because the students who were engaged in it were very conscious of those things too, just on their own. We really worked hard to extra inform them and say, this is important and that's why we want you to have the right to refuse. It's a process, but I think it's a really useful one because ethics are hard to teach. So if you can put them in practice, I think that's a good way for students to learn them. And it makes them understand the value of someone's story. If they're willing to share it and you've gone through sort of the ethics behind it, I think they understand that it's a pretty special thing.